Hello, and welcome to this program of the CSIS Energy Security and Climate Change Program. Today we're talking in prelude to the COP28 conference in the UAE about the broader politics of the Middle East, climate change, and trying to interrogate what we should look forward to at this conference, not just in terms of what the conference is going to accomplish with like negotiations amongst UN parties or big announcements out of one or industry coalition or another. But we really want to understand what this COP means in the broader evolution of the region. And to help us do that, I'm joined today by Dr. Jon Alterman, my colleague here from CSIS, the director of our Middle East program and Brzezinski Chair in Global Geopolitics?
Global Security and Geostrategy.
Global Security and Geostrategy. Jon is a real expert in the Middle East. And I thought today we could have a chance to chat for a few minutes about what it actually means, not just that the UAE is hosting this conference, but what it means to the UAE and to the Gulf more broadly to be part of this global dialogue and try and stake out a leadership position within it. Jon, thanks for coming today. I'm delighted we get to have this conversation, which we've had many times, but now we get to have it in the nice studio.
And other people get to listen to it.
Well, unfortunately for them, perhaps. But what if we start there? I mean, if you're talking to one of my climate friends, and they have a picture of the Middle East. They have a picture of Gulf countries. They know that they're large oil producers. They know that these countries have been sort of recalcitrant at various points in climate negotiations. Now the UAE is hosting the COP. What do you think is most important for that group of people to understand about the modern Gulf and what that might mean for COP negotiations this year?
Well, it seems to me that the Gulf states have all internalized that there's going to be a global energy transition. They have gotten increasingly used to the idea that they have agency in the world, partly because they have large resources that they can deploy pretty quickly and pretty aggressively. Mm-hmm. And they're interested in shaping the way the energy transition unfolds. There are differences between countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, but for all these countries, this is hugely consequential. It is going to shape their future over the next 3 decades and beyond. They feel a need to be successful, and importantly, a lot of the leaders now believe they're going to be in power in 30 years. So they're in a position to think and invest strategically in a way that other governments might not. They're interested in not just being on the producing side, mm-hmm. but in making the transition, whether it's toward hydrogen or renewables or whatever. They feel a need to be part of that conversation. They can't drive the conversation. They want to be part of the conversation. And it seems to me that a lot of what the UAE is doing in trying to host this COP is to join that conversation. Don't forget, as you know, the UAE hosts the International Renewable Energy Agency. So the UAE has been interested in the renewable space mm-hmm. for a very long time. They built Mustar City, what was initially billed as a zero-carbon city, years ago. So the UAE wants to portray itself as not just being dragged kicking and screaming, but also a country that can play a role in the conversation determining what the shape of the energy transition looks like.
But is there irony here in that the UAE has just massive per capita energy consumption, right? Mainly because energy in the UAE is quite cheap. And
the climate can be miserable for a lot of the year.
Right. Yeah. Very warm. Right. High air conditioning bills. Well, high water use. Which a lot of that is desalinization. And so a lot of the country is bankrolled by oil production. Right. So at the same time, you have you have the UAE hosting a COP that is trying to keep 1.5 degrees climate target alive. is focused on tripling global renewables capacity. You know, the chair, the president of the COP negotiations, Sultan Al-Jaber, is also the CEO of ADNOC, which is planning to increase its production capacity for oil over the next 5 years.
And was the founder of Mustar, their renewable energy outfit.
Right.
So, I mean, Sultan Al-Jaber is involved in a lot of strategically vital projects to the UAE. The UAE is intimately involved in the energy business.
Yeah.
And will be intimately involved in the energy business for years to come. Again, the question is, can they play a constructive role
Right.
shaping the way this transition unfolds? As producers, they have a view. As folks located where they are, they have a view. Geography gives them a view.
Right.
They have a view because of their trade relationships with countries like China, with the United States. It's complicated, and my sense is the UAE wants to be active and not passive.
Right.
And that's part of what the UAE has been doing for decades, is for a country with just over 1 million citizens, how do you engage with the world in such a way that you advance national interests, protect national security, and it's a proactive government.
I mean, this is actually one of the places where I think is most interesting is, and you've really helped me understand this, the degree to which, these the UAE is a relatively small country in terms of population, definitely in terms of size, has this like outsized role in the global energy system because it's a pretty large energy producer. But that what that also means is you have a lot of available capital to not just like, you could easily characterize it as just like throw at things, but also just you can kind of make deliberate or strategic choices that, for us in the US, it's going to take Congress 10 years to work out how it wants to change a spending program. In the UAE, that can happen much faster. So the UAE's made significant investments in renewables. They've built the first nuclear reactors in the Middle East, commercial ones. And can you help us kind of understand how does decision-making work so that you could see like pretty substantial movement of capital into different parts of the energy economy, into different investments around the world, and how does that reflect the role that the UAE or other Gulf countries want to increasingly play?
The UAE, like Saudi Arabia, has a relatively young, very proactive, dynamic leader with profound domestic support. A lot of these governments in the Gulf start with a profound reservoir of goodwill because everybody in the country looks and says, my life is better now than it was 10 years ago, and it's better 10 years ago than it was 10 years before that. So there's a sense at which a lot of people, certainly citizens, feel the government has really made important decisions and has raised the standard of living. You can say this is shooting fish in a barrel because they had a lot of money.
Right.
But I think the relationship of the public is we trust our leadership. Mohammed bin Zayed, the current president of the UAE, starting more than 20 years ago,
Right.
built institutions. That's partly about building what was called the Executive Affairs Authority with experts who partly were doing investments, partly doing governmental studies, initially just for Abu Dhabi, which is the wealthiest emirate and the one with the most citizens, not the largest population. Dubai has a larger population, but Abu Dhabi has the most citizens. And Mohammed bin Zayed, often known as MBZ, created a bureaucracy with genuine meritocracy,
Right.
and engaged on national projects or projects with national import. The other thing he did, which I think is very interesting and frankly visionary, is for 20 years, Abu Dhabi has said, we have to take human capital development seriously and put it at the center of what we do. So Abu Dhabi has created a cadre of relatively young, now in their 40s, very well educated, very cosmopolitan technocrats who've proved themselves, who've been given increasing responsibility, and who can work together because they've been working together for 20 years under MBZ's aegis. And that's created, I think, a force multiplier that no other Gulf country can match, and frankly puts them at a par with a lot of other countries around the world because they really have bureaucracies that are led by really capable people, and that the ability to work across institutions and to have people who are comfortable in world fora and know how things work
that's
over
really...
time creates an A-team that they can deploy on climate issues, on foreign policy issues, on all these things, which has differentiated themselves from a lot of regional countries. And I think the Saudis have a lot of the advantages that the Emiratis have, arguably an economy that's 4 times as large, much larger population, but they haven't had the investment in human capital. And this is where they really have to play catch up, because the Emiratis, as I said, they've been investing for a long time, and they're reaping the benefits of those investments.
And how should the external, I mean, that's very interesting. Like, how should the external observer look at this? I mean, it's been very controversial that Al-Jaber was selected as the president of the COP, right? CEO of the national oil company. I always read that, not as an endorsement of him, but, like, that's probably a very competent person in the UAE, right? If you've kind of got a meritocracy, like this, like, vital public institution is going to attract the people who are most capable. And then, presumably you want really capable people being in charge of this COP process too. Does that reflect the kind of professionalism that you're talking about? Like, did I have the right read on that?
So Sultan, I mean, I probably met Sultan Jaber the first time about 10 years ago, maybe a little more. Like me, he's actually a little taller than me. He's about 6'4". He has always had too much to do. They have always layered responsibility on top of responsibility. Hard problems, you work with a hard problem.
Right.
He's developed tremendous trust with his bosses. He has a remarkable capacity to work. He is tough to work for, but he produces results. And I think, what's important in this case is when you have a situation where the government says, the leadership says, we have to be successful. This has to be no fail.
Right.
We have a guy who we actually trust. We have a guy who can work internationally. We have a guy who understands complicated issues. We have a guy who knows how to manage difficult timelines, and Gantt charts and all those things are second nature to him. We've got that in our stable, and we have people like Maria Meheri, who's the Minister of Environment and Food Security. I mean, she can do other things, right? I mean, you've actually, it's not just Sultan Jaber, but you have somebody like him who, in addition to all the other things he's doing, can run a really complicated process. It's not normal, in my judgment, for countries with 1 million people to have a Sultan al-Jaber who can play at the top level internationally and has trust of the boss. A lot of countries don't have anybody like that. The UAE has Sultan al-Jaber, Dr. Sultan as they call him, plus the whole cadre of other people to support. Reem al-Hashimi, who helped run Expo. Right. I mean, there's Lanuri Sebu, who's the ambassador to the UN. Khaldoun Mubarak, who's the head of Mubadala. I mean, they're all these folks who have built experience over time. They've made mistakes. They've learned from mistakes. And now you get to this point, and it's like, people talk about the demographic dividend. This is the HR dividend, right, that you've been investing for 20 years, and now you get to benefit from having a team that's worked together, that's really competent on the international stage, and can take really complicated things that no other country with 1 million people can do and execute at a world standard.
Well, I want to get your perspective a little bit on the historical, right? You mentioned this kind of 20 years of institution building in the UAE. You've had a long career working kind of from Washington on Middle East issues. You said at the very top that you think now countries in the Gulf and in the Middle East more broadly really do see an energy transition coming. They're taking it seriously. It's part of the planning that they're doing. It's part of the economic program, reaching for diversification. How has that conversation, from your perspective, evolved over the last 20 years? And can you identify for us any kind of tipping points or points where you've really seen a change in the dialogue?
I do think that COVID was an inflection point.
Okay.
That and we had oil markets get really screwed up at the beginning of COVID. But I think that was a point when the idea of shifting energy economics became very real. I mean, suddenly world consumption changed. And to me, there's a difference between people talking about that theoretically and people seeing demand curves really move. But certainly the Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia made a big push for Vision 2030, which long predated COVID, and which was an effort to wrap Saudi's head around a different future. The interesting thing about Vision 2030, and other countries in the region have different visions, a lot of them are 2030 visions or whatever.
Sure.
But the interesting thing about Vision 2030 is that it started off as a very foreign idea, cooked up largely by McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group. It was implemented in a sort of mechanical way with, here are our goals and here are key performance indicators and here's how we're going to do this. And it wasn't integrated. And I'll tell you, when I go to Saudi Arabia now, and I go back and forth with some regularity, the extent to which everybody accepts both change is very real, change is necessary, our future is going to be really different from the past. This is a conversation, again, a lot of it changed over COVID, but the sense of possibility, the sense of dynamism in the Gulf is so much more than it was 5 years ago. Frankly, so much more than was imaginable 5 years ago. It's partly a consequence of the UAE sort of adopting a strategy of, if you build it, they will come.
Yep.
But it's also Saudi Arabia and the government getting young people really enthusiastic about change and really bought in. Not all young people, but a lot of young people, and the opportunities for entertainment, the opportunities for employment, young women entering the workforce and having remarkable chances that were unthinkable a short time ago. The sense that the government is really coercing tolerance in Saudi Arabia, forcing people to give space to people who want to do different things, live different ways, has created a really interesting dynamic. The commercial possibilities in the Gulf are different now. I think we run the risk of underestimating the depth of change, the difficulty of change. It's easy to get fixated on, I saw a woman who was just wearing a scarf around her neck in Riyadh. So isn't that
driving a car?
And you get driving an Uber, and you get sort of distracted by dress.
Yeah.
As if that's a barometer of either how much freedom people have, how much economic activity is. So I think it's a more complicated story than we often give it credit for. And we pay attention to things that might not be really good indicators of what's happening.
Yeah.
But I think overall, there is this sense of excitement and possibility,
right,
which really wasn't there 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Which I think is necessary but not sufficient for the transitions they will be making. The energy transition is one. I think there's going to be a set of cultural transitions, a set of economic transitions, a set of governance transitions. There's a lot
Right.
that these systems are going to have to do, and they will do it over decades.
Yeah.
But there's a process of change underway, and we have to appreciate there's a process of change underway.
One of the last time COP was held in the Gulf, it was in Qatar in 2012. And I was doing a little historical research in preparation for today. And there was actually a couple things that came from that conference. I don't know if you recall it, but just for memory's sake, the countries at the UN negotiation agreed to extend the Kyoto Protocol at that conference. But more importantly, they introduced this phrase, loss and damage, to the negotiations. It's a term of art in the climate world. More or less, it reflects agreement in principle that rich countries might have to compensate developing countries for damages wrought by climate change. The U.S. has always been very skeptical of that view, but it is going to be part of the negotiations this year at COP. And what I think is interesting about it, when I talk to colleagues from the Middle East or people involved in the COP process this year, they see an opportunity to sort of be a bridge between the global North and the global South. Part of that, I think, is geographic. Some of it, I think, is cultural, right? A lot, a lot of developing countries have large Muslim populations. And some of it, I think, kind of relates to the recent development of the Gulf countries and sort of the aspirations that you see in emerging markets around the world. What is your read on how the Gulf countries kind of view their role in global politics and, projected onto this COP? Like, COP has to be in the Middle East every 10 years or so, right? That's
the second year in a row, and they've offered to host it next year too.
Yeah, which they may have to, because otherwise it was supposed to be in Eastern Europe, and you can't really have it in a conflict-laden place. But the point is, it sort of has to come around to the Gulf, but I think it's important to kind of use it as a timestamp to say, how does this relate to how the UAE and the Gulf countries see their broader role in global politics?
I think, on the one hand, they see a rising role for themselves in global politics, and it's not just over energy issues, it's over issues of security, political Islam, relationships with great powers. I mean, these countries have complicated security concerns, and with, as we discussed earlier, huge amounts of deployable capital. They're interested in deploying their capital in ways that they think serves their national interests. Large as their tranches of capital are, the needs of the developing world totally outrun their scale.
Right, yeah.
Right? I mean, a country of 1 million people or 1 million citizens can have an important trade relationship with a country like India, which has more than 1 billion. But the scale of the UAE economy can't meet the needs of the Indian economy. To me, there's a bit of arbitrage going on with the Gulf states trying to position themselves, but they're positioning themselves so that the wealthier Western states are doing most of the heavy lifting. And they will facilitate, they'll help contextualize, they'll play those kinds of roles, but I don't think they see themselves playing a huge role. They certainly want to play an active role. They see it as part of their leadership. I mean, they want to be involved, but it's my sense that when we're talking about loss and damage in a place like Pakistan, the scale of the economic challenge outweighs the scale of Gulf economies, and they don't feel the responsibility. One of the other pieces of this, which is interesting, is how many expatriate workers come from the global South, and live in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, and so there's a certain comfort and intimacy that Gulf governments have with a lot of these other governments. Sometimes there's some strain, there's a concern with worker treatment, other kinds of issues, but it's not foreign. It's familiar, and I think that contributes to a level of engagement that the Gulf states are keen to have with with some of the largest states that are most affected by loss and damage concerns.
Yeah, and it's not just loss and damage. It's sort of that the climate negotiations for the last 30 years have been sort of plagued by this developed countries dynamic, right? It's loss and damage. It's the ability to leverage climate finance to make clean energy investments available in developing countries. The climate problem is vexing because the ability of the world to hit the climate targets it set for itself in the Paris Agreement really hinges on our ability to develop low carbon economies around the global south, right? Like the US, the EU, even to some extent China can decarbonize. And if we don't solve the other bit of this problem, we're going to miss our targets. And everyone is kind of searching for a way to unlock that puzzle, right? And one of the things I'm looking forward to at this COP is how well a sort of different political presidency is going to be able to leverage, I like your phrase arbitrage, right? Sort of like arbitrage what the Western governments are going to be willing to do with what private capital out of the West is going to be willing to do. And can they build a big enough coalition that we take a substantial bite out of that big problem? That I think is like very interesting. And it's one of the, when you think about 10 years from now, we look at this COP as a success or not, I think that will be one of the key things we want to look for.
And one of the other interesting things is increasingly Gulf states are interested in investing, not giving aid.
Yeah.
And, what I hear from people who engage with them, both on the international financial institution side, but on other sides as well, is they pride themselves on being skillful investment bankers. Mm-hmm. They evaluate deals, they evaluate projects, that they're really interested in getting in the weeds on, is there a return here?
Right.
When push comes to shove, is there an investment banking-based
mm-hmm.
solution to some of these issues? What would it look like? How would it be implemented? Do they open the door to other banking-based solutions to these problems? Do they squeeze it out? I don't know how this plays out, and I don't know how ultimately receptive some of the recipient states are going to be. But it feels to me like this is one of the things that's moving, and we're not paying enough attention to it, is the Gulf states are not in the aid business anymore in their mind.
Right.
They're in the investing business. Do they do it differently from the way we do it? Do they do it differently from the way the Chinese do it?
Right.
And is it consequential?
Well, in that case, I think definitely in the energy space, you see that, right? There's a lot of investment coming out of the Gulf in renewables projects around the world. Some extent, maybe hydrogen. We made it 28 minutes into the conversation without bringing up hydrogen, which is pretty good for us. The Saudis got a big plan for minerals, right? It's sort of an investment in mineral supplies around the world. So I suspect that we'll see real honest attempts in that regard. How much of it, how much of that replaces what is the current kind of like very, very productive role of oil is probably yet to be seen. But I definitely see movement on the energy side of things. And it does involve global investments. We're running up against time, and I'm really grateful for your perspective, Jon. What are, you're not as much a climate person, but you're aware of it, and you're a Middle East person. So, what are you looking for in COP, if anything? And, what kind of signposts might you try to watch for over the next few weeks?
I mean, it does seem to me two things. One is the UAE going to be able to really shape what feels to me to be an increasingly ragged conversation, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, my take as a non-expert on what happened in Sharm el-Sheikh last year for COP.
It was a little woolly, yeah.
It wasn't really people coming together. It was hard to get statements. I think there's partly a question of will the UAE, through its skillful hosting, be able to work its way through some of these difficult issues and create more coherence. I think the other thing to look for is, do we see increasing convergence or divergence among oil producers in the Gulf. There seems to be a lot of competition between the UAE and Saudi Arabia on some of these issues. Are other countries going to get into the mix? Again, are they going to come together on certain principles, and will the world go along? Will the world decide it's aligned against the Gulf, or will countries in the Gulf try to one-up each other?
Right.
And is competition in that regard good or bad? And that's obviously not something that's going to be resolved in
December,
this conference.
Right.
But I'd be looking to see if there is more convergence or divergence on that issue.
And there are attempts to try and bring together the national oil companies with large integrated oil companies to set targets for methane and funding pledges for methane abatement, and especially in smaller countries that have trouble financing that stuff. So there will be points that we can look at on that regard. Jon, thank you very much. We've hit our time limit, and colleagues who are joining us online, thank you very much for being part of the conversation. Our program's going to host these on Thursday afternoons leading up to the conference. Next week being Thanksgiving accepted, and all through the conference we'll be tracking developments with reports from the UAE and then reports from folks coming back. So I hope that you'll join us for those sessions. Once again, thank you to Dr. Alterman. This is Joseph Majkut signing off.